So, welcome. I'm Chris Cook. I'm the contributing editor at Tortoise. I'm going to be chairing this evening's Think-In. If you've not been to one of these events before, the basic idea of the Think-In is that journalists typically meet to discuss topics with just other journalists. Journalists have a very strong views and a lot of knowledge about typesetting, but not very much about anything else. And therefore, we need to bring other people into the conversation to make sure that when we make our decisions and think about what we're doing there. Next, we have an appropriate array of expertise. I'm really pleased that we have a genuinely remarkable panel this evening. I have a sort of BBC gene in my brain still that makes me terrified about balance. And it is a feature when you deal with Northern Ireland that it requires actually quite a lot of people to get to balance. So we're going to have to be quite brisk this evening. But we have 5 really remarkable guests. We've got Ailbhe Rea, who is a political correspondent in the New Statesman. She co-hosts the New Statesman podcast. She writes one of the parts of the morning email. She writes the morning email a few times a week. She's very good. We have Matt O'Toole, who is a member of the Assembly for the SDLP. He's a former civil servant. He's a journalist who's worked previously for Number 10, a very unusual person who both been clobbered by Brexit as an individual, having to work in the civil service before moving home to Northern Ireland to be clobbered by a second time round. We have Siobhan Fenton. She's an advisor to Sinn Féin in the Oireachtas, a word I can never pronounce. And she's a journalist herself. She's an author of the book, The Good Friday Agreement, which analyses Northern Ireland's status as a post-conflict society. We have already with us Claire Sugden, who is an independent unionist MLA. She sits for East Londonderry. She's a former Minister of Justice. And I think it's fair to say, Claire, you're one of the more liberal members of the unionist voting bloc. We also have Sammy Wilson, who I think is not quite joined us, but will be joining us, I'm sure, imminently. Sammy is a DUP MP for East Antrim. That's the right-hand side, if you like, a stripe of Northern Ireland. It's where the Port of Larne is, facing Scotland. Sammy, I think it's fair to say, is not one of the more liberal members of the unionist voting bloc. I was actually hoping we could start off by talking to Ailbhe. Oh, I should say, if you want to contribute, we're very keen on it. If you want to put your hand up, you can do that using some of the buttons at the bottom of your screen, or you can contribute in the chat. To your right, my colleague Zav will be engaging with people and flagging people to talk to me. I was wondering if I could start by asking Ailbhe to quickly explain to us sort of where we are today. We start off with rioting, days of rioting across Northern Ireland. Can you just explain to us what's going on right now and why we've got to where we are today?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I feel like I need a big caveat that I'm used to explaining what I'm about to explain for an English audience. So I feel a bit nervous being on a call with lots of other Northern Irish people of all different perspectives. So I hope this summary does everyone justice. But so communicating the causes of the recent violence and riots that we've seen in Northern Ireland over the past, it's 6 consecutive nights now over the past few weeks. I think that it's really important to kind of communicate that there are 3 big causes of these riots, and that the disagreements are really caused by, I mean, everyone's in broad agreement that there are the 3 big causes, but the disagreements come from how much weight the different other panelists that we're going to hear from put on each one. So the first one, which would probably be the one that springs to mind for most people, is the sort of simmering discontent within the unionists, so the broadly British Protestant community in Northern Ireland, simmering discontent over the implementation of the Irish Sea border as a result of Brexit, which came into effect at the beginning of the year. So it's all very recent. This is obviously a huge affront to a unionist sense of national identity, as well as causing untold economic disruption for everyone in Northern Ireland and further afield. That's the simmering, like, longer term reason. And then this has been catalysed in the past few weeks by a decision not to prosecute senior Sinn Féin politicians, including the Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, over attendance at a funeral last year for senior Republican Bobby Storey in alleged breach of coronavirus rules, which Sinn Féin politicians themselves in many cases made. That this has been bubbling away also for quite a few months, but the decision not to prosecute them within the past week has really sparked off more tension. But then there's the important third element, which I think is the bit that we're not hearing so much in the British conversation around it, and which is the hardest bit, I think, to explain to British viewers of this thinking, which is, I think, the important element that in this sort of Northern Irish political ecosystem, there is a presence of paramilitary groups still in post-Good Friday Agreement society. And paramilitary lends it a kind of glamour that it doesn't necessarily deserve, in that these in a 21st century context tend to effectively just be criminal gangs involved in petty criminality and drug dealing, but with historic links to the Troubles and organized violence and so on, and with these like deeper political roots. They have their own reasons for encouraging. It has been, if people look at the footage, it has been younger people mostly out demonstrating against the police in recent days. They have their own reasons for encouraging younger kids to go out and demonstrate against the police, and that is that there have been recent police crackdowns on the paramilitary activities, their criminal activity in recent weeks. And so they have their own reasons for encouraging younger people to go out and sort of push back against this recent police crackdown. So those are the three big reasons: Brexit, the decision over the Bobby Storey funeral, and then the influence of paramilitaries. And I think if you miss any one of those out, you distort the picture a bit. So it's important to get all three.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Albert. Well, I wonder if we go to some slides. I've got a very brief crash course in the Good Friday Agreement, which we can quickly whisk through. When I say brief, I mean really brief, right? So the first point about this slide that I'd like to show you is to get one big thing across, which is that the Good Friday Agreement is always illustrated by pictures of basically two men, so John Hume and David Trimble. It was actually an agreement between 8 groups inside Northern Ireland, plus the British government, plus the Irish government. It's a sort of unusually broad consensus that it relies upon. And actually, if we go to the next slide, the agreement is structured in such a way as to try and sort of keep everyone on board. It's a sort of consensus-reliant, consensus-building machine. It's got things, the most important, I think, the first strand, the strand on how Northern Ireland itself should be run. It also has strands about relationships with Ireland and relationships with the UK and how our islands collectively work together, which are intended to sort of keep the show on the road. If we go to the next slide, what I mean by when I say that it's a sort of consensus building machine, the whole structure is intended to basically require cross-community collaboration in government. So each side can get things it wants, but it kind of has to be bargaining and done through a sort of a consensual process, a consociational democracy, as they call it. Move on to the next slide. We've had a bit of trouble lately. So since 2017, things have been scratchier than they have in previous years. The Assembly wasn't sitting for a long period, and at the moment it looks like, I'm not clear how many of our panelists would bet on the Assembly still being sitting in a few months' time. If we move on to the final slide, one of the context of this is, of course, partly about Brexit. As Alva says, it's only one part of the issue here, but it's we are where we are. The Brexit was a decision that within Northern Ireland was supported by, as you can see, many more unionists than nationalists, and that is part of the dynamics of what we can see today. I was wondering if I could come to Sammy, who has now joined us, putting him immediately onto the spot. There we are. So thank you ever so much for joining us, Sammy. I was wondering if you heard Alva's 3 reasons for why there's discontent at the moment: the Brexit border, loyalist stirring, and Bobby Storey, basically. Is that a fair summary of where we are?
I did, Chris, and at the risk of destroying any career which Alba wants to have in the media, can I say that it's probably one of the most succinct and accurate descriptions that I've heard over the last number of days about the sources of the violence here in Northern Ireland. I think she's covered all of the arguments and all of the issues, and she's quite right, of course. What weight do you put to each of those? The only thing I would say, and if any comment to make on her analysis, the role of paramilitaries, I suppose, has been hotly debated, because she's quite right. Most of them are now criminal gangs. They engage in drugs and other criminality, and I'm not so sure that they actually wish to see the police attention to their areas which this rioting actually brings about, because of course it means heavier policing. It means more difficulty for them in doing the kind of deeds which they do in their own communities. So that there probably is some argument as to whether or not the paramilitaries welcome this, or whether they're instigators of it, or whether they would rather see it go away. There's another motive, of course, and one way of recruiting lots of young people into their ranks who can then be used in the general criminality in which they engage, is to get them involved, first of all, in actions on the street, such as we have seen over the last number of days. Chris, there's just one point that I would like to take up with you in your analysis of the Good Friday Agreement, because you've missed out one very, very important part of it. In fact, the most important part of it, as far as the unionist community was concerned, because the Good Friday Agreement required huge sacrifices by unionists. In effect, it put terrorists into government. It released terrorists from prison onto the streets. But the one thing which many unions, I didn't actually vote for the Good Friday Agreement, but those unions who did vote for it were supportive of, was the fact that there could not be, and this is the commitment made by all of those who signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, there could not be any change to the constitutional position of Northern Ireland without the consent of the people in Northern Ireland. And the protocol, of course, makes a massive change, because in future 60% of our laws will not be made in Westminster, will be made in Brussels. We'll have no input into those. If we try to and refuse to implement them because they're damaging to the Northern Ireland economy, the European Court of Justice, a foreign court, will adjudicate as to whether or not we have broken the law and will impose the relevant sanctions. Now, that's a massive change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland, and it's that which has caused so much anger, frustration, which has been exploited in the way we have seen over the last number of nights.
That's fair enough. Can I ask one thing? I mean, one of the things that's quite striking today, watching what was going on in Stormont, was the sense that it's quite hard to see where reconciliation comes from at this point. So it's quite hard to work out what a roadmap back to sort of de-escalation looks like. Can I ask what you think needs to happen right now?
Well, I think the first thing is that, I mean, at present, there's a lot of outpouring of anger, wrongly directed, in my view, towards the police on the ground through these riots, etc. And the first thing I think that needs to be done is that there has to be an admission by the police that they did assist Sinn Féin in breaking the law. I mean, that's what the Public Prosecution Service made it quite clear, that they could not take forward a prosecution for two reasons. The first one was a fairly dubious reason. First of all, the law was not clear. Now, the law clearly stipulated that only 15 people could be at a funeral, and Sinn Féin had actually told the police they would have 94 seats at the grave. Plus, we were going to have hundreds of people in the cortege and the political rally beforehand. And the police gave them permission to do so. So the law was quite clear that it was being broken. But, and this was the second part, the Public Prosecution Service made it quite clear they did not believe they could have a successful prosecution because of the contact which there had been between those who attended the funeral and those who therefore had broken the law and the police, because the police clearly had given information. And you can imagine the public prosecution service thinking, well, look, we go to court. It then comes out in court, by the way, there are these discussions between senior officers, assistant chief constable and above in the police with Sinn Féin, that Sinn Féin said, we're going to do this. We know it's against the law. We're telling you what we're going to do. We want the police to operationally make certain decisions, not to impede the parade, not to arrest people at the funeral, etc. The police agreed to that. Now, what chance would you have had of a prosecution? So I think that the police have to, first of all, accept the responsibility that they have for this situation. The protocol issue is one which the government at Westminster has to address if it wishes the union not to be broken up, and if it wishes to ensure that democracy exists in Northern Ireland. Because, you know, I doubt if there's any other part of the United Kingdom where citizens would accept that laws could be made in a foreign jurisdiction. They would have no say at all, because there's no mechanism for them to have a say in the making of those laws. They would have no option but to obey those laws. And if they didn't obey those laws, a foreign court would then impose sanctions on them. Scotland wouldn't accept it. Wales wouldn't accept it. No part of England would accept it. And yet that's what the protocol states in relation to Northern Ireland: a huge democratic deficit and a huge rift between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, when an assurance was given that that could not possibly happen without the consent of people in Northern Ireland. Now, that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we're going to see, we haven't even seen any change in European laws yet. But, you know, you're going to have a member of the Assembly on later on. I doubt very much if he, even though he's an anti-Brexit politician, I doubt very much if he thinks it's a great idea that he sits in an assembly where there are laws imposed by an outside jurisdiction and he doesn't have any say in how they're made, he doesn't have any say in how they're shaped, and he doesn't even have any say in whether they're applied to Northern Ireland. Now, that has to be done.
Well, so that is a good moment to bring him in. So Matt O'Toole, I mean, the first thing is you are in, you know, you're a Belfast MLA. There's, you know, which is why I don't actually know if any of the issues are in your seat, but how do you respond to Sammy?
Well, Sam, just on Sammy's point about, I'm going to do something I don't think I've ever done in my life before and probably won't do for the rest of the evening. Sammy's last point was that the protocol is basically is not an optimal situation, and I agree. I agree with Sammy on that. I don't think it is an optimal set of relationships for Northern Ireland. I suppose I would say I don't think Brexit's optimal for the whole UK for anywhere on these islands. The protocol which existed before, the backstop which existed before, was a much more preferable arrangement for Northern Ireland in particular, because it would have avoided some of the disruption of goods moving from Britain into Northern Ireland. So that was much more preferable. We can rehearse the reasons why we don't have the backstop. I suspect probably for the sake of having a constructive conversation, it's better not to. But you know, it is the case that the protocol is not anyone's first choice. Like, I haven't met anyone who would say this is how you would, this is an optimal situation that you would design. It is, from my perspective, still better than the alternative. And I would say 2 points to follow up on that. I have no difficulty in acknowledging the real and sincere constitutional concern that gives to people of a pro-union persuasion, whether they're working class loyalists or not. I understand that, and I don't seek to diminish it or demean it. I suppose my comment would be that logistically, lots of the checks that will inevitably have to be done on the basis of the UK diverging in a dramatic way from the EU single market and customs union, logistically they couldn't be done on land, even if we wanted them to take, for example, SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Those really rely on there being, effectively completely different sets of rules between the UK and EU in terms of plant and animal health. I'm afraid on the island of Ireland you couldn't have them. That would just be impossible. There have never been completely divergent rules in terms of agricultural standards, food standards. We have a single ecology on this island. We have we have farms that straddle the border. It's not possible. That's not a nationalist point. That's not seeking to say that a land border or national sensitivities are more important than unionist sensitivities. They certainly aren't. It's simply the case that in many ways you couldn't do these borders on land. That's not to say that we don't want the easements. We don't want the protocol to work in the smoothest possible way. That's what we've said the whole way through. So I think there's a job to be done for people in political unionism and in all parties to talk constructively about how we make these issues work. As I said, not to rehearse the point, we didn't want Brexit in the first place. I left my entire career. Chris, as you alluded to before, I was a civil servant with quite a good career in London. I then left, and then I had kind of an easier life working as in the private sector, doing some occasional journalism and punditry. I left both of those things and came back here to be a politician, in part because I was motivated by Brexit and trying to make this thing work. And part of making it work is looking for the advantage and the benefit to it. And that includes access to the British market. I think that's something, having access to both the British and European market is something that's good for Northern Ireland. So I would welcome being able to work with Sammy's party and others in unionism to sell the uniqueness of Northern Ireland's position. But that does require all of us to swallow things and to accept that we can't have the perfect situation that we'd all like. I'd rather we hadn't left the European Union. I'd rather the all-island services economy wasn't disrupted. I'd rather, if I get the chance to go to Donegal this summer, I'd rather not have to call my car insurance company and ask to put on a special green card, but I do. So hopefully we can move forward more constructively. And if anything good, I say that advisedly, comes out of the awful scenes of the last few nights, and hopefully they don't go on, but we can't be certain, is a like a commitment to making these things work constructively.
Do you think, is there anything, do you think there's anything we can do short term about, to Sammy's point about the police?
On the question about the police, there is, like, it's clear that what Sinn Féin did around the Bobby Story funeral did cause alarm, not just among unionists, by the way, but among lots of other people. That's not something that was got up by unionists alone. My party held Sinn Féin to account for that, as did Alliance, as did the Green Party and others. So there were concerns about that. But I think when it comes to questions about the police, it is always worth saying that the police do have a very difficult job to do in a society like Northern Ireland. We, about 20 years ago, had a completely fresh start in policing. We had changed the way we police, and we introduced a new form of public accountability. I think it's really important that those structures are used in order to get answers in relation to policing. I think there's a lot of kind of anecdotal statements made about two-tier policing and about people being frustrated about one police action or another. I think it's much more important to use the actual structures that exist. And I suppose that's what I would say. I'm not sure it's been particularly wise. Some of the statements coming from some leaders around calling for the Chief Constable to resign before there's even an independent review has come back on the way this thing was handled. I'm not sure that was the right way forward, but some of the language today has been a little bit more measured, and I hope that continues.
Great, thanks, Matt. Claire, I wonder if we could come to you. Claire, how do you? So you're from a slightly different part of the unionist tradition to Sammy. I think it's fair to say that. What's your feeling about it, and what would you? Is there a path that you can see back to calming everything and to making sure that the structures can sort of work into the future?
Sure. Ultimately, I think we have to get back to the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, which is around recognising that there are two dominant traditions within Northern Ireland and others. And I think sometimes moving away from 1998, people almost wanted to sidestep the realities of people having constitutional beliefs. And I think in 2021, what the Good Friday Agreement should be teaching us to do is to actually embrace that each of us has our own ideas about the constitutional position on the island of Ireland. And that's perfectly fine. And I think we learn from one another by engaging and having those conversations. And I think that's ultimately what the Good Friday Agreement was about. And, I suppose sometimes I get disappointed and when people say that my unionism isn't relevant, but when we provide services in respect of health and education, we either do that in the context of the United Kingdom or we do that in the context of our Republic of Ireland. And for me as a unionist, I think that best context is within the UK. You know, so I think we have to almost desensitize unionism and nationalism away from the kind of cultural aspects that have enveloped it for so long. And that's difficult because I think people do associate very much with identity. And I think the violence that we have seen in Belfast and other parts of Northern Ireland over the last number of days has been that feeling that people's identities are being eroded. And, you know, Alva described it very well in the different aspects which has contributed to that. I think the Northern Ireland Protocol and the misinformation to an extent that is within those communities around that. I think the Bobby Story funeral, and, you know, Matthew's right to say that wasn't, you know, a green or orange issue in Northern Ireland. That was a confidence issue in our political leadership, that they were making laws that they themselves were breaking, and people of Northern Ireland were making significant sacrifices, as everyone across the UK and the world were doing, yet the people making those laws were breaking them. And that, you know, if anything, is conducive to the fact that we had 3 years of no government in Northern Ireland. So there's a public confidence issue around politicians generally in Northern Ireland, and the Bobby Story funeral and, you know, the leadership around that didn't really help those things. And then I think the paramilitarism is another, you know, difficult aspect in Northern Ireland, because sadly, you know, in Northern Ireland, I think the only way that we move away from paramilitarism is to build our communities up so that they can't be exploited by these elements within their communities, because that's what's happening here. You know, the people that are leading, you know, this behaviour on the streets are people that are doing it for their own ends. They're not doing it for a cause. It isn't a cause, it's criminality. And I think what our government needs to do is actually do their job. Good governance, you know, go into those working class areas, look at why these kids think that there's a better alternative in paramilitarism. There's not, but the government isn't providing enough for them either. So I think we really have to look at good governance in Northern Ireland if we genuinely want to make Northern Ireland work. And I think that goes back to the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. People take their own interpretations of the Good Friday Agreement. Some would tell me that it was a stepping stone toward a united Ireland. Others would say that it was a settlement. And I think now, 23 years later, we need to have a look at what that means to individual people and individual societies and recognise that each person's opinion on it's valid.
Do you think that can I ask you, I'll ask the others this in turn, so don't worry, you're just the first victim, but do you think the executive will survive the next few months?
I think it's volatile. I think it always was going to be. You know, we had a situation.
This minister as well. I mean, and this is obviously with your experience of sort of with the police as well. Do you think is there a way through as well?
I think we have to get back again to doing the job that we were elected to do, and that's governing for the people of Northern Ireland. You know, the structures require that it is a power sharing arrangement, and to an extent that's a forced coalition. So we are going to have issues. We have political parties from different ends of the political spectrum, you know, not, you know, in addition to the unionist nationalist context. And, you know, making those decisions and making those policy changes that are required to move Northern Ireland on was always going to be challenging. And I think my biggest disappointment when the Assembly was restored last year was that we didn't have an opposition. We didn't provide the people with an alternative. We didn't provide them with I suppose, leadership that could say, well, you know what, if we're not doing it right, then you have someone else to vote for. And I think that was our biggest mistake. You know, so I do think it's right 23 years later that we look at the structures within Northern Ireland and we recognise, is that what we need? Because I think we have to bear in mind, in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed with the aim of stopping the violence. And, you know, 23 years later, largely that has happened. We have seen, you know, issues over the years. You know, it's not just in the last couple of days where that violence has erupted again. But again, I think that points to the biggest failure of the Good Friday Agreement, and that's to reconcile the people of Northern Ireland, to understand why we had to park an issue rather than actually embrace it. So maybe now, 23 years later, we have to recognise these constitutional issues. We need to understand why people think they're better part of the United Kingdom, what that means in terms of their culture. You know, if we talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, what does that mean? Is it eroding people's identity? And those things are really important, not just to people in Northern Ireland, but right across the UK, just albeit in a different context.
Thanks ever so much, Claire. Siobhan, can I come to you? You've written about the Good Friday Agreement as well as being politically active yourself. Where do you think we go from here?
So I think I would agree with Claire's point there, that I think that the current situation does feel like it is very volatile, but I do think that as long as there is political leadership across the community, that I think that I would have, hope that we wouldn't see any kind of similar scenes with the executive collapse as it did 3 years ago. I think that the government at Stormont, while it's not perfect by any means, I think it is definitely the best option for everyone here. And I think that anyone who would suggest that the executive could or should collapse needs to be very clear about kind of what does that mean in the long term, and what would the alternative be. So would that be direct rule from Westminster, and would that kind of be in any way kind of better than the current situation, and how would that have the kind of confidence of all the communities as well? Because I think that I understand that, of course, there are lots of criticisms about the protocol and of course about the Good Friday Agreement, but the key issue here is that while they're not perfect, I do think that those are the best options that we have, given the huge complexities and kind of diversities of identities here. So if people kind of are criticizing these different institutions, I think they have to be very clear about what exactly would happen next, and what exactly are those better alternatives that they would put in place.
Can I ask can I ask the question I asked Claire? Can I put to you again? Do you think, I mean, if you had to bet, do you think the executive will last the next few months? And can I ask where you think we should be looking too? I mean, I think the one of our members has said in the chat, it's a living Mark McAvoy, it's a living document, right? It's a thing that it's not supposed to be sort of preserved in aspic. What do you, where will we survive the next few months, and then where from there?
I think personally, I would feel confident that we would survive the next few months and much longer, I think, but that's as long as everyone shows that leadership. It does feel like the last few days has seen a huge escalation in some of the rhetoric and some of the tensions, both at a kind of formal political level and then at a grassroots community level as well. So I think as long as everyone is showing that leadership and having kind of complete unequivocal condemnation of the current violence, I think that should be key in terms of being able to kind of bring people back together and realize the most important thing in terms of preserving the peace and keeping communities safe as well. But I think I certainly agree with what you touched on there, the fact that the Good Friday Agreement didn't just sort of kind of happen in 1998 and then stop. It's always a bit of a teasy thing to say, but the fact that it's kind of called a peace process, I think, is key to it. The fact that it is a process. It wasn't that politicians sat around a table 23 years ago and kind of ticked a little box called peace and kind of walked away and that was finished. I think it's a ongoing continuous process of people from unionists, nationalists, loyalists, Republican identities, and then of course your communities and people who don't have any affiliation to any of those identities at all constantly engaging in dialogue together, making sure that different developments are taken into account and responded to in a way that is genuinely respectful, and with that peace kind of always as the kind of primary focus at its core. But I think there's no doubt that over the last few years, particularly in terms of Britain and the North leaving the EU, that has put a lot of those what kind of previously would have been seen as accepted or settled questions in terms of identity in the North. I think a lot of those have been kind of seen as being reopened again, and that has reopened many old wounds and kind of left a lot of people kind of re-engaging in those more heated debates. But I think as long as there is clear leadership, I think that will be what we need to kind of keep tensions calm. Okay,
thanks ever so much. I wonder if I could come back to Alva. So your day job, Alva, is worrying about Westminster politics. Can I, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much attention is being given to this issue and has been given to this issue over the last few weeks?
Oh, good question. I think that at the beginning of the week it was a 1. 1 as in 1 on the low end, not on the high end. And then I think that I don't know what it was about the scenes last night. I think that there's a particular symbolism around violence flashing up at particular flashpoints. I think around the peace walls at the Lanark Way interface. So in West Belfast, between the Shankill Road community and the Springfield Road, I think that the way this violence took place, there were also the shocking scenes with the petrol bomb being thrown into a bus, which I think captured the imagination. But I think it's the combination of that and also the symbolism of the peace wall. I think people in Britain with a sort of vague interest in Northern Irish politics could well have visited those places on the sort of tourist trail of the Troubles. And so I think that there's the kind of the symbolism around that and the flashpoint being there means that really within the past day there has been a bit more engagement with it, some of it better informed than other stuff. I think that there is a tendency to collapse the entire debate into Brexit, which is a huge element of it, and this is an event occurring, as you were saying, you know, in post-Brexit Northern Ireland, and so it has to be viewed through that lens. But so I think that the interest has increased, but it hasn't always been terribly well informed, and I think it would just be worth noting on that as well, with my sort of Westminster political correspondent hat on, that there isn't really much political will from either the Conservatives or Labour to really engage on this, because none of them really want to be having a conversation about the Brexit deal for different reasons. In the Conservatives, Boris Johnson didn't do some sort of magic Houdini thing when he got his Brexit deal. He just crossed his own red lines on a border down the Irish Sea to secure his Brexit deal. And sort of him breaking his promises effectively on that makes this a terribly uncomfortable subject for him and for his party. And then on the other hand, Labour, you know, they didn't support Brexit in the first place, but they are trying to win back the support of people who did vote for Brexit, and they're kind of trying to move into a post-Brexit era of politics. So even though I think Louise Hay, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is very engaged on this, and Keir Starmer, like Boris Johnson, has condemned the violence, I think that in Westminster it's not really in the big party's interests to be making a big thing of this, which is where we're seeing a bit of a faltering from the leadership from Westminster.
Do you think the executive will last the next few months? I'm asking everyone this, so I will put you on the spot.
I'm really interested to hear what the panelists have said so far. I mean, I think yes, because of what Siobhan said. Like, what is the alternative? Direct rule from Westminster. We tried that within the past few years, and it really didn't work for the people of Northern Ireland. And so I think maybe when push comes to shove, that it won't happen for that reason. But you heard Sammy saying what the DUP wants in terms of a recognition from the police. Some kind of apology there. They're still pushing this really hard. That's basically pushing for a very uncomfortable thing for their partners in government and Sinn Féin. And I think like dealing with that around the Bobby Story funeral, if it doesn't work, it'll be because of that. Right.
Thanks ever so much, Albert. I wonder if I could come back to Claire. Claire, I asked basically because, as I said before, you come from a slightly different part of unionism to Sammy, but do you think is the police the focus for you as well? Is there I think it's the thing I'm trying to get clear in my head is the extent to which you think it's possible to get to a sort of workable world with the Brexit protocol kind of in place, as eased up as possible, but is that sustainable? Can the Good Friday Agreement sort of rumble on with the level of discontent and unionism that there is just from the Brexit deal, if we can sort out the police stuff?
It's interesting because the policing issue only really seemed to arise in the last number of weeks, and I think the issues that have led to this, that have created this almost simmering pot of issues, extend much further than that. So I'm not sure if my focus would be the police, and certainly with the violence in the last number of days, I think if anything we should be supporting the police and and giving our confidence to ensure that we don't escalate into something that gets out of control and ends up in a really bad situation that we saw a couple of years ago. I think what we need to do is represent communities, because I suppose what we're seeing in the streets is an outworking of people being confused, being frustrated, being misinformed about the issues in and around Brexit, and to an extent being exploited. And I think there is a particular population, working class loyalists and unionists, who feel disenfranchised, who feel that they're not being listened to, who feel that their feelings about a union are being disregarded. Because I think we also have to put this into the context of the calls for a border poll. We're hearing from people that it's inevitable that there is going to be a United Ireland, there is a border poll. That's not the case. If anything, what's happening is they're gaslighting loyalists into thinking that, that there's going to be a united Ireland, and I don't think that's fair. And the Good Friday Agreement states that it will only be through the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. So to hear daily calls about a border poll, about an undermining of their constitutional position, I think is actually quite insensitive to what's going on, and I think it adds to the wider issue. So I think what we need to do is we need to get back to the people. We need to start governing for them, because whether your aspiration is a united Ireland or you wish to remain within the United Kingdom, you need to make Northern Ireland work, and you need to make it work for everybody within it. So I think where we to try and have to bear in mind as well, Chris, there's an Assembly election next year, and there's an awful lot of politicking that's happening, and there's an awful lot of posturing from all political parties in relation to that. They will be mindful of that. Candidates are already being announced, so they will be playing to their voters and they'll be playing to their audiences. I just think we need to be very careful that it doesn't spill over into something that we can't control and we can't pull back from. I have to say that from a protocol issue, for me, it's a trade issue. It's not a constitutional issue, but I can understand why it's giving rise to those calls. And to be fair to businesses, both East and West, I've had calls from GB, from England, frustrated that they can't get their goods to Northern Ireland because for them it's a market. So I think we need to look at those issues. We need to deal with them, and if they're not working, then maybe we have to look at an alternative, because Northern Ireland shouldn't be cut off from other parts of the United Kingdom. They shouldn't have the same or less opportunities that anyone does. And maybe after all of that, there might be opportunities to put Northern Ireland on the map where they have access to two markets. So I don't want to say let's wait and see, because in doing that we've had violence, but I think we need to get back to what matters, and that's about trying to serve people and leading them. We need leadership.
So in a sense, you think that I don't want to put words in your mouth, so forgive me if I get this wrong. You think the deal is effectively, it's bad, but it's not as bad as some of the loyalist communities have been led to feel. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen, and I think the concerns that I'm hearing from loyalist communities are not necessarily representative of what I understand the Northern Ireland Protocol to be. Right. So I think what we need to do is we need to inform, and we need to find a way forward. There are issues, there's no doubt about that, and we need to work through those issues. But equally, all this kind of narrative, all this talking up isn't helpful, and we've seen that over the past couple of nights.
Thanks ever so much. Matt, if I could come to you on that. So on Claire's thought about some of the nationalist, some of the nationalist rhetoric being unhelpful at the moment. Do you think is that a criticism you recognise? I mean, I don't think, to be fair, people are aiming this at your party, but.
Well, I think so. I mean, it's always worth saying that part of the challenge of this society is that there is a kind of superstructure of kind of sectarian angst that is exploited at both poles by, bluntly, the two major parties who represent that. I have to say, particularly, at times the DUP have been particularly willing to do that. That isn't the same thing as having a constitutional preference or a long-term vision about what you think might be in the interests of Northern Ireland. In terms of the rhetoric, I mean, I would say inevitably Brexit represents change. It's a disruption to trading relationships across between Britain and the European Union. The protocol obviously is a particular set of arrangements for Northern Ireland. As I've said, it's necessary. It offers clear opportunities, but it's not suboptimal. You wouldn't design it from scratch if you were trying to get there. So it does need work in terms of implementation. But inevitably, given what's happened, and given sometimes I think one of the things that happens when you get into Northern Ireland politics is that, maybe one of the things that I suppose has preoccupied me since I've been here is that we sometimes act as if Northern Ireland was not affected by or shaped by what was happening, not just in other parts of the UK or Ireland, but in other parts of the world. Lots of political scientists will have pointed, Siobhan wrote a book about this, have noticed that the Northern Ireland challenge was partially solved in the 1990s, when the world was on, as famously been said, a holiday from history. and Northern Ireland became a foreign policy project that lots of external actors who were previously, until about 1991, were engaged in much bigger issues to do with the Cold War and geostrategic power plays, were able to focus on dealing with this relatively marginal civil conflict in Western Europe that was hellish for those of us who lived through it, but was ultimately a part of British-Irish history that didn't intrude into bigger questions. But we had successive US presidents who spent a lot of time on it, and we had the European Union engaged on it, despite what some have said about them not being engaged on it. They were certainly engaged on it in terms of funding peace projects. But so I think what that tells us is that Northern Ireland is affected by things that happen, externalities that happen. We know the UK state is changing. It's not, so yeah, I mean, I agree that there has been rhetoric that has been at times intemperate by people from Sinn Féin, bluntly, about how constitutional change should happen, might happen, and will happen. I and my party do believe in constitutional change, and as Claire rightly said, it shouldn't be verboten or inappropriate to talk about your constitutional preference. In a sense, what the Good Friday Agreement does, in my view, is kind of create a set of rules of the road and a bit of a covenant in terms of how you talk about it and how you approach it, and it's fundamentally about pluralism. I think the truth is that neither of the two big parties in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin and the DUP, are best placed to talk about their vision for constitutional change on the basis of pluralism, to be perfectly honest. And so they struggle to set out a vision for their constitutional preference, which is genuinely plural and reaches out to people who aren't instinctively part of that tribe, as it were. But having said that, and to come back to the point since you asked me, Chris, I think it would be disingenuous to pretend not to acknowledge that Northern Ireland exists within a UK state which is changing. We can see the UK state changing every day. It's clear that in big ways, the UK state, specifically this Conservative government, but the state itself, feels slightly discomfited by the settlement that was created in the late 1990s, which included devolution in Northern Ireland, a particularly complex, convoluted and subtle arrangement in Northern Ireland, which included a special arrangement across the island of Ireland. And that was why Brexit was so complicated, because of the complexity of that arrangement, but also included a kind of variable geometry in terms of one kind of devolution in Scotland and another kind of devolution in Wales. That fundamentally changed the nature of the UK state. But it's clear that a lot of the, that people are pushing back against that now. That state is changing. And there's a huge amount of hostility. We know about the rise of English nationalism and the effect that's having on UK politics. Alva mentioned earlier on Labour, and I think Lou Hayes doing a great job, and Labour are our sister party. But the Labour Party is in a position where they aren't as able to engage on these questions of Brexit as they would have been before the last election. And I get that. All of which points to a UK state that's changing, and that does mean that questions are going to be asked about Northern Ireland's position within that. But it's important that we approach those questions in a way that is pluralistic. And I think where I would agree with Claire is that when you're talking about constitutional change or your constitutional aspiration, and you designate, in my case, as a nationalist because you believe that the best end point is removing the border in Ireland, the way to do it is less to talk about the date of a border poll or say we want this to happen now, and I want this to happen by X date within the next 18 months or within the next 2 years, and instead to do the hard work of building relationships with people who want to persuade and setting out a vision of why you think that would be a better and more optimal way to govern this place, and what relationships across these islands would look like. So I don't think we can avoid those questions, but the real critical thing is that we approach them in the most respectful way possible. And my God, over the last few days, we've seen why that's important. It's incumbent on all of us to measure our language and to approach our everything in the most respectful and careful way we can.
Very briefly, Matt, do you think the executive will survive the next few months?
I think probably it will, because there are vested political interests at the minute for both Sinn Féin and the DUP in making it survive. I think it would, bluntly, I don't think it's in either their interest for it to collapse. But, the institutions in Northern Ireland have proven that that's not necessary. Why strategic heads do not always prevail. I mean, I'm not a supporter of either of those parties, but I can see why it's in their clear political interest not to walk away from the institution. So I think that it probably will survive, but that's not guaranteed. And, it hasn't been perfectly functional. My colleague Nicola Mallon said this in an interview the other day. it hasn't been perfectly functional since they came back. And the blunt point is, Chris, we do have to make Northern Ireland work. Whatever your constitutional position, I agree with Claire on this. You do have to, if you believe in the United Ireland, you need to make it work. And if you believe in the United Kingdom, you need to make it work. That's the kind of, it's not a Chinese finger lock. It's a very clever constitutional settlement which binds us in to making this place work. And I'm afraid it's not easy to make it work when the two big parties are fundamentally not about pluralism. And I don't mean to be too pointed about it, but they aren't. And so I hope people, like, if there are any Northern Ireland voters on the call, I hope people next year, whether they have no constitutional preference, whether they choose to replace those big parties or reorient the composition of the Northern Ireland Assembly.
All right, we're going to stop billing you for advertising. Siobhan, I wonder if I could ask you, I mean, do you think that's you've had basically, Sinn Féin's had a bit of a kicking from everyone else, as I think is a constitutional requirement in any sort of conversation like this. Do you think that there's something to what Claire and actually Matt say about whether the situation has been inflamed slightly by, I guess you'd say, over ambition on the part of some nationalists?
Well, I think I would definitely agree with Claire when it was just kind of putting across the perspective that for a large number of unionists, the thought of a united Ireland is genuinely extremely worrying for them, and it absolutely is the responsibility of nationalists and Republicans to kind of work through those concerns and really put in place a very credible and detailed plan for Irish unity. And I think it's definitely not helpful to anyone or to any perspective at all for people to kind of be demanding huge constitutional change, or for there to be a United Ireland kind of first thing in the morning. I obviously, very strongly support United Ireland. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I think that would be a really positive, progressive opportunity for everyone across the island. But I'm aware that will be a very much a process, and that you can't sort of just announce that and expect to spring that on people. It's something that you have to discuss and tease out so many incredibly important aspects of what would be huge change, so that you're really bringing people along with you on that. It's one of the things that I think certainly Brexit showed in such stark and clear ways, that you can't just have a referendum on a very sort of short binary yes/no choice and then kind of do all the discussions and the detail and the groundwork after that. So I think that there has to be, an incredibly detailed discussion of what a new and United Ireland would mean in practice. And it's one of the things that Sinn Féin's policy would be, that we would have a citizens' assembly called, which would be representative of people across the island to discuss those issues. It was a mechanism used prior to, for instance, the referendums on repealing the 8th Amendment, the abortion ban in Ireland. So that was kind of put in place so that, after the referendum on the abortion legislation, it wouldn't be, should abortion be legal, yes, no, and then people kind of have to work out afterwards what would be the term limits, what would be the kind of legal status versus decriminalisation. Instead, what happened was that Citizens' Assembly had discussed in advance, what that exact policy would be on abortion legislation, and then that was put to the people, and it's worked for a variety of different kind of policies and changes to the constitution. So I think that would be a really helpful mechanism for people to engage with, because we need to look at, what would the education system be? Would people continue to do A levels in the north, or would they do the Leaving Cert? Would we have a national health service, across Ireland, or just in the south? Would there be the Gardaí as the police service in the north, or would we still have the PSNI? And there's so many incredibly complex aspects which we need to tease out in a very respectful way, so that it's not just kind of nationalists and Republicans, deciding, this is what we've sat in a room alone and decided is going to happen next, and then springing that on people. It needs to be done in a very delicate and respectful and very detailed way, which is focusing on public policy and really looking at the very specific outcomes of all these different areas.
Thanks ever so much. I was wondering if we could go to Mark McAvoy, who's one of our members. So I thought, Mark, you raised a point about Northern Ireland's capacity to sort of do this on your own, and whether you need outside assistance on this stuff.
Yeah, I made the point as well a bit earlier in the conversation about how the agreement is a living document, and I think I can't avoid the impression, and I think a lot of voters can't avoid the impression that post 1998, other parties, the British government, the Irish government, the Americans, formed the view that the peace had been won and that we could more or less be left to get on with it. And that impression was allowed to crystallise, and I don't think it was the right impression. I can't blame anybody for that necessarily, but we have not been allowed, for a variety of reasons, I think, to mature into a sufficiently stable democracy. And the institutions we have are too complex, I think, for the degree of democracy or the maturity, the extent of the maturity of democracy that we have. And that's why I think there is need to review. I mean, we still have some very bizarre concepts, like as the representatives on the call will confirm, cross-community vetoes, where if one side does not like a particular measure, it can exercise a veto, but that has been exploited to extremely bizarre ends. And all of those sorts of mechanisms need to be kept under review and revision. And I don't think, credit where it's due, and all due respect to the representatives, they're going to be able to get round the table to have or to thrash out those sorts of loose ends without external help. They're going to have to be. I'm not addressing this directly to Claire, Matthew, or Sammy for that matter, but the people involved in the discussions are going to have to be coaxed, I think, by the British and Irish governments, perhaps the EU and indeed the Americans. That's in the past, unfortunately, it's taken external contributors to force people to make difficult decisions, and I can't but avoid the impression that that's going to prove to be the case again in the not too distant future.
Thanks ever so much, Mark. I was wondering if we could come back. We are officially out of time, but I was going to quickly come back to Sammy. I just wonder whether you, Sammy, whether you're, first of all, whether you think, I have to ask you as well, whether you think the executive will be in place in a few months' time, but also, where do you think we're going from here? And do you think the agreement will survive the next few years?
Well, I think that, first of all, Chris, the agreement has already been undermined, damaged, and in my view, is dead. Because as I explained at the very start, the fundamental principles and foundations of the agreement, namely the need for consent, has been removed, and that then leaves everything else which is associated with the agreement on a very shaky foundation. I think the second thing, and let me just explain that in terms of the survival of the Assembly, for example. I think that whether the Assembly survives or not will depend upon decisions will be made by Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin brought the last Assembly down because they believed that they could gain political advantage by some of the things that had gone on around RHI and the impact that had on my party, and thought they could become the biggest party. They brought for 3 years, we didn't have an Assembly because Sinn Féin refused to go back into it, and the British government refused to take any powers to Westminster to deal with the political vacuum. So Sinn Féin knew that the setting up the Assembly depended upon a time of their determination. And I think that if they make the judgment in the next couple of months that there is some political advantage in bringing the Assembly down because the polls show that they may become the biggest party, it'll be brought down. I think the second thing is that the structures, and people have mentioned the structures have led to the kind of dysfunctional government. I mean, we're asked to operate a coalition. No, we're not asked, we're told we've got to operate a coalition, which in terms of England or Westminster would involve Jeremy Corbyn having to form a coalition government with people like John Redmond and others on the right wing of the Conservative Party. Now, no, I'm told that, by the way, you don't even have the option if things don't work out to look for new partners. You've got to stick with those partners. That's why you've got a dysfunctional government, and the structures will need to be changed. I have absolutely no doubt if we're going to have functional government. And Claire's right. Anyway, you need to have some form of opposition rather than.
I think you meant John Redwood rather than John Redmond, because I think John Redwood might have been in there. He might have been in a storm of coalition.
John Redwood. I think I said. I thought it was John Redwood. Yeah. So That's the situation that we have, and despite the way in which Matt has tried to describe the role of the SDLP, etc., no party in the assembly can really say that it's been a pluralist party. I mean, I look at the SDLP's abysmal record of siding with Sinn Féin and naming play parks after terrorists, in refusing funding for the celebration of Northern Ireland's centenary at council level. And I could give you lots of other examples. So, I mean, nobody's hands are clean when it comes to this idea that we have to operate in a plural society. At the end of the day, people tend to go back to the section of the community which they believe they get the most representation from, and even if it means making decisions which in contexts outside Northern Ireland would seem appalling, they make them. And that's why I think that the whole essence of the agreement has never been developed, and now, of course, it's even worse. It's been undermined, and on top of all of that, we're now going to have an institution which is not going to have control over most of the laws which apply to Northern Ireland anyway. So people are going to call into question, what is the role of the politicians which we elect to storm it, if the rules which govern our lives on a whole range of things, from the hours we work to the regulations that we have to abide by if we're farmers, etc., are made in Brussels and imposed by the European Court of Justice. So, I mean, I think that we are in a very, very dangerous position, because the foundations of the structures that we had have been undermined. New arrangements have been put in place which are undemocratic, and we haven't even discussed. I mean, when it comes to the protocol, all we've discussed today is the trade disruption. The most fundamental issue is the lack of democratic accountability that there'll be for laws in Northern Ireland, and the powerlessness of those who are elected to have anything to do with it. And for all of those reasons, I think that we are at a position where, as Mark has pointed out, we probably are going to have to look at fundamental change in how the country is governed, who makes up the government, whether we have compulsory coalitions any longer, or whether we have voluntary coalitions with opposition.
I mean, I think, Sammy, I'm struck by we run out of time actually, so I have to basically just wrap up. My desire to continue arguing with you has unfortunately is superseded by the clock. Thank you ever so much for coming, all of you. I warned at the beginning that the difficulty with Northern Ireland is that you basically is time. You always need a lot of people to talk about it because of the variety of perspectives. It is a plural, if not always pluralist, place. And I'm really grateful to all of our guests, to Siobhan, to Matt, to Sammy, to Alva, to Claire, also to Mark McAvoy, to William Jeremy, who I've seen has been piling into the comments. I'm sorry we didn't get time to come to him. I feel like I'm modestly, I guess that one of the big questions for everyone looking forward is basically whether Sammy's right or whether Claire's right about the ability of political unionism to hold the line. If we can sort out the policing stuff, if Sammy's right, then that's not enough. If Claire's right, maybe that is enough to sort of keep the show on the road. But I feel like that's the big question to go for, to take away from today. Thank you all for joining us. Brilliant. I look forward to seeing you all at our forthcoming meetings.